Hey everybody, this is Science for 7th and 8th, and today's lesson is for April 30th, I believe. April 30th, May 1st, because what has happened for science is you all were finishing up a test and I believe a quiz from chapter 2, and chapter 2 was starting plants. So we've gone over plants, we've gone over photosynthesis, dicots, monocots, all the different families we've done, angiosperms, gymnosperms, which we were going to go into that a little bit further. Now you have flipped the pages 10 chapters and we're on page 432. So what we've done is gone from plants and now we're going to forestry. Which technically forestry is the study of trees and shrubs, or is called dendrology, but nobody knows what that is, so we call it forestry. And to me, this was the natural progression, is we start with plants and then you go straight to trees, rather than the way they had it. It's like you did plants first and then you do nothing. We go into mammals and all this other stuff and then you go back to forestry. So I was just trying to make our book seem to flow a little bit better, even though you're having to flip back and forth. But we're on trees on page 432, and we're going to try to get through 12.1. I have sent with you nothing for chapter 12 for this week. You will not get any sheets on chapter 12 until you get your pickup, which would be May 4th. Yeah, on May 4th, you'll be actually picking up some stuff and some quizzes and some sheets for those. This will be probably the last chapter that we actually have any testing and quizzing over. I might do a couple of videos where we're just going over ecology, maybe just that's our last chapter in the book. We did skip one chapter that was in your book. I think it was chapter 5, which was over evolution. Is that the chapter? I can't remember. It's over evolution, and you get so much of that in Bible. We covered that a whole, if we might have more time to do that in next year's science. It's not that it's not important. It is. It's just they made this big, huge chapter on it, and I'm sure most of y'all, don't believe in that, and we don't need to go into that whole lot of detail. But that's just how it worked out this year. I'm not trying to say it's not important. So let's look over trees. Okay, so trees are some of the most beautiful and useful parts of God's creation. It creates us, it gives us a lot of things, not just shade. It gives us our national forests that we have. We have national parks, and most of y'all think, okay, that's a cool place to go and hike. But most of the time surrounding those parks and even surrounding some of the state parks. And then we just have places that are just occasionally like, okay, here it is. We have state forest and we have national forest as well, which quite often surround the national parks. And that's just extra wilderness land that is preserved where you can use it for recreational use, or you can get permits for hunting and for different things for those areas. So it provides us recreation, provides us fruit for food, like oranges, apples, those type of things. Fortunately, trees are an abundant and renewable resource, providing a never-ending supply for some basic needs, like what am I going to build my house with? Wood, that's normally the structure. Even if you have a brick home, that structure inside it is wood most of the time, unless you got steel or something wild. And that it's a never-ending supply for products that fulfill basic needs like housing, food, and clothing. Trees are used to make thousands of items every day. Of course, most of the time when you think of wood and what is used, if you go beyond building products, you probably start thinking of paper, right? That's the best known examples, but trees are also used to make lots of other things, all the way from fabrics to pharmaceuticals to toothpaste to garden hoses. God also created trees to express His glory. You have a verse from Isaiah 41 through 19 through 20, and I want you all to remember where Israel is at and what Isaiah is describing, and then I just want you all to look out your window. I've said it numerous times. If Abraham was coming from Mesopotamia, fairly arid nation where, the land between the two rivers had some green because of the irrigation from the rivers, and that's basically what Israel's like too. They have irrigation from rivers. They would not know what to do if their eyes hit something as green and lush as what Tennessee is, because they had never seen anything like that in that area at all. But he is describing lots of somewhat deserty trees. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar, the shittah tree, and the myrtle, and the oil. I will set in the desert the fir tree, and the pine, and the box tree together, that they may see and know and consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord hath done this, and the Holy One of Israel hath created it. Isaiah 41:19-20. And there's all kinds of books in the Bible and verses in the Bible that talk about trees and how majestic they are. I think I shared one in the last chapter that one of my favorite books also comes from Isaiah, and it talks about talking about someone who has really deep roots into the into the deep waters of the Lord, being called oaks of righteousness because they have such deep roots. Of course, they're talking about deep roots going into an aquifer or a natural well that's really under the ground that you can't see so much from up on top of the ground. But us, being able to see that oak is strong and standing because it has such deep roots going to the water. And us, we're strong and standing for righteousness for the Lord's sake because we have such deep roots in God or in the Holy Spirit. So all of God's creation basically is a testimony to Him. And that's how I think we should approach science. So let's talk about trees. Now, we have a description about a tree, and we have a description about a shrub. If you asked an actual dendrologist, because you have people who specialize in just trees, just shrubs, just trees at this size, just shrubs at this size, this is basically a loose definition given by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It is not super specific for like a scientist. So a tree given by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, is a tall perennial woody plant with a single main stem or a trunk, and then it divides into smaller stems called branches. For trees, most trees are at least 13 to 16 foot tall when fully grown. A woody plant that has several equally large stems instead of a single main stem is a shrub. And a full-grown shrub is normally shorter than a tree, so it would be shorter than 13 to 16 foot tall. Those would be shrubs. Some types of plants can grow as either trees or shrubs. So the top portion of a tree, just looking at the anatomy or the parts of a tree, the top portion of a tree is which concludes the branches and the leaves, is the crown. The crown basically has one of two basic shapes, and you've got them right there on page 32 if you just want to go with me. And you can imagine, you've seen this. You have a tree that is a spreading branch, and that has several main branches close to the ground, producing a crown that's somewhat rounded. Well-known trees that have spreading branches include oaks, maples, elms, and it's hard to see in woods trees that look like this, but especially if you have an oak or an elm or a maple that's out away from trees, those limbs are just able to spread and that crown's able to spread. In woods, just because there's so many trees there, it tends to go straight up and you have really high limbs. And that might be a reason why you can really climb trees in your yard really well. If you go to one that's out and there's all these trees, the branch is really, really high up. But those are like, when I imagine oaks, maples, elms, those trees are easy trees to climb because there's normally a low limb. And you can, pull yourself up. These are the trees you would build your tree house in. This is, the tree you normally want in your yard because it spreads out and it gives shade. Compare that to spire-like branches. And I have climbed both, but back in the day, but spire-like branches occurs when a tree has a strong central trunk producing tall, narrow crown that resembles a cone. This type of branching is found on trees like pines, redwoods, and cypresses. Now, there are some pines that because they're grown in a pine forest, their first branch is really, really high off the ground. And then there's some pines that you might have in your yard that they can spread out, that they have branches that go all the way down to the ground. But you would never really want to build a tree house or to, really climb a whole lot in a pine, and two reasons. First of all, they're easy to climb. If you ever have climbed a pine tree or a hemlock tree or something that's in your yard, it's almost climbing a ladder. But the higher you get up, the smaller the branches get, speaking from experience, and you could easily fall. But where on the maple, if you got that tree house and it's spreading, it's just a much sturdier tree. Now, don't get me wrong, if you keep climbing to the top, it does get smaller and smaller. So the spire-like branches, though, you can't, where in that maple, you can kind of get through the canopy and you can kind of see. The spire-like branches, it's kind of hard to see. That's just in mind. Plus, they tend to be evergreen trees, and you cannot climb evergreen trees without getting all this sap all over your hands. And that stuff is hard as all get out to get off your hands. So if you have never experienced climbing these variety of trees, most of you already have, then I'm just going to tell you that's my experience. Maples, oaks, because I mainly had maples that I could climb and that my children could climb as well. But when you try to climb like these, evergreen ones, they're easy to climb, but you get junk all over you from their sap. So looking on at tree types, there are either angiosperms or gymnosperms. Angiosperms, which produces seeds by forming flowers, are called broadleaf because their leaves are actually broad and flat. And one thing I was going to report, because I just noticed on my maples, and you might have some maple trees where you're at, and if you don't know what a maple tree is, what a maple tree looks like, look up the flag of Canada. And that leaf that's on the flag of Canada is a maple leaf. So that might give you a clue as to what maybe a maple leaf is and what a maple tree is. But the little helicopters have formed on my maples. And remember, that was the seed pods or the fruit of the maple tree. They've bloomed, they've created their little seed pod, and that's what makes the little helicopter, as they fall, they can really get a good spin, and they can go far, get picked up by the wind, and sail. So those are broad flat trees. Common broadleaves are ash, beech, elm, oak, maples, and willows. Now I will say, we've talked about the elm tree a few times here. The American elm was basically hit by a blight that began happening in the early 1900s. Now, not just the American elm was hit by something like that. The Dutch elm disease is what got them. But there was also our American chestnut tree, which I don't know if not necessarily here, but especially where I grew up in Virginia and the Appalachian Mountains, there's all these mountains that are called white top. And you always wonder, why do they call these mountains white top? And it was because those American chestnuts would bloom and look really, really white. It would almost make the tree, that mountain look white when those chestnut trees were blooming. The chestnut tree got hit by a blight too. Those were practically gone by the 60s and 70s. We actually had a few elms on the property that we bought here, and now most of those elms have finally given up the ghost and just died. Our neighbor had a really huge one, perfect for climbing, and it was massive. It's the natural shade tree, that beautiful shade tree that you see in neighborhoods, and most of those have been hit. Those old 100-year, 200-year-old trees have been hit by that disease that came through, the Dutch elm disease. So you probably don't have those as much as you once did. here recently. What has been dying a lot as you go through just driving and you see all these dead trees, it's like, okay, there's a lot alive, but there's a lot dead. You're especially going to notice it, here in a couple of months after all the greenery's on. Those are ash trees. So our ash trees have been dying. I think it's a beetle. No, we went through a thing like where the pine beetle was killing pines. Now it's like something else is hitting the ash trees. I think it is a beetle. I don't know. I'm not a forestry person. You could look that up. So that's common broadleaf trees. Because several broadleaf trees have a hard, dense wood, broadleaf trees are also called a hardwood. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all hard, regardless of the wood's actual hardness. Most broadleaf trees are in warm regions are deciduous. There's a term we've not had in a few years. So deciduous simply means that they lose their leaves in the fall and they stay bare all winter, but they're not dead. And then when the spring starts, they grow their leaves back. Gymnosperms are non-flowering seed plants. We learned about that in the previous chapter, in chapter 2. And they have cones as seed bearers rather than a fruit. And their leaves are totally different. They have scale-like, needle-like leaves. Many gymnosperms are evergreen. And evergreen means they're not deciduous. Unlike deciduous, they keep their leaves during the winter. Gymnosperms are also called softwood trees. But a lot of gymnosperms are harder than most hardwoods. For example, fir and larch are examples of softwood trees. Yellow pine, which is a huge, it's a very renewable source. A yellow pine is normally, after you plant it from a sapling, they can normally harvest it within 20 to 25 years. That's a very renewable tree, and it's an extremely hard wood. So it's used in a lot of building industry. So if you think, I don't have no wood in my house, that's probably when you hear your dad talk about studs, especially if they're trying to hang up a picture and trying to find a stud, put this on. That stud is probably made out of yellow pine. If you look at decks, lots of the structure of that deck is made of yellow pine. Now, there might have been a different, some planking that's put on top of the deck that's not yellow pine, but that's a hard wood. Now, if we look at conifers, there are 3 well-known types of gymnosperms: conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. So conifers are those natural evergreen trees that you're probably just picturing. So the most common gymnosperms are named for their cone-shaped reproductive structures like pine cones. They include common tree families like pines, firs, hemlocks, spruces, and redwoods. We really don't have the redwoods. We kind of have some of the other stuff. We have really beautiful hemlock trees around here. I think more so than even where I grew up, especially go to any of these big parks. Pickett, the little Colditz Cove that's got the waterfall. There's some just really, really beautiful hemlock trees that are through there. They have a bit of a bigger needle. I mean, you'd think, most of you might think, it's a cedar tree. A cedar tree doesn't get that big. I mean, it can get big, but it takes a long time. Hemlocks are huge, and they're an extremely hard wood as well. So, hemlock, spruces, and redwoods. Conifers produce both male and female cones, and most of the time those cones are on the same tree. So the female cones contain eggs. The male cones contain the pollen. Female cones have a familiar cone shape. The male cones are really, really small, yellowish, almost look really worm-like, and they grow in little clusters, and you would look at it and think, what is that? Male cones consist of hundreds of thousands of stamens arranged along that string-like surface, because remember, they're producing pollen. And lots of times, guys, when those things are producing, they might be producing some now, there's some that produce in the fall. That is normally what is covering your car in yellow stuff, because that pollen is wind-borne. Since conifers are wind-pollinated, each produces tremendous amounts of pollen. You might have realized this after seeing a car covered in yellow or orange dust after it's parked around conifer trees. We have a lot of pines and cedars and things like that behind our school in these woods. So yeah, our cars normally get covered up in that stuff. So the shape of the female cone creates air currents that encourage the pollen to travel to the cone and pollinate the eggs found at the base of the scales or the wooden leaves of the female cone. Once the pollen fertilizes the egg, the seeds are produced inside the cone. The scales will close around the seeds to protect them, and a seed will develop on each cone scale. Now, the yew and junipers are conifers whose cones are actually berry-like structures called arils, and we really don't have yews and junipers. If you do, it's not something that's just natural. We've got them. They're further north, and there seem to be more prevalent yews and junipers, like in Scandinavia and British Isles and places like that. And yes, just to tell you how crazy our ancestors were, they did use the juniper berries to make alcohol from, which is pretty hideous looking, but we use corn and make stuff from it. So, as the seeds mature, the scales will open to release the seeds, and in many conifers, the seed is slow to mature, and the cone does not open for 2 years. Seeds are often paired and winged, and the papery winged extensions will help the seed catch the air current and then float away from the parent where it can grow in an uncrowded place. So we are now going to go over just a smidgen of the who's who of conifers. Yeah. So the tallest trees, of course, are the coastal redwoods. We are not on the right coast. The coastal redwoods would be on the west coast. So California, Oregon, Northern California, we should clarify that, Northern California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, those areas. So that they commonly reach heights 200 to 300 feet. Hyperion is a coastal redwood that was found in 2006 that currently holds the record for the tallest tree, which is 379.1 feet. You also have Douglas firs that are found in the western United States and Canada. They're the second tallest trees. One variety, the coast Douglas fir, is usually between 220 to 250 feet, but they can reach up to 350 feet. And another tall tree is the giant sequoia. Not only do sequoias reach heights of 250, but sequoias are also estimated to be really, really old trees, that they could be up to over 3,000 years old, but they're not the oldest trees. The oldest trees are these really hideous-looking bristlecone pines. So the oldest known organisms on the planet are the bristlecone pines found in California. Once again, California's White Mountains. These trees are believed to be 2,500 to 3,500 years old, but they're not much of a tree. If you look at them, they're pretty scrubby. Then we have a few really unusual gymnosperms. We do not have these indigenously to Tennessee. Some we do for North America, but they just aren't normal for Tennessee. So cycads are a unique variety of slow-growing palm-like gymnosperms. The cycad has a pillar-like stem with no branches, frond-like leaves clustered at the top. Cycads grow in tropical and subtropical environments. The Japanese sago palm is a common southern landscaping plant, and the kunti or the Florida arrowroot is the only species that is native to the United States. Many cycads we know are now extinct because there used to be a whole lot more cycads, but we mainly have them in fossil records. So you can see the sago palm that's there that they've given you, but like I said, we only have one that's really indigenous to North America, and that's the Florida arrowroot. The other weird one we don't have here, if you have, now we've got them, you can look at them, they're just not indigenous to Native America. The one ginkgo tree, I guess that was just in my face. You can see them lots of times at parks, but there's one not too far from the White House in D.C., and it's like it used to be part of I think it's actually in front of the Treasury. It's one of those buildings that's really close to the White House. But the ginkgo is a unique species of oriental gymnosperms, and it has short branches and fan-shaped leaves that turn bright yellow and fall quickly in autumn. Ginkgos grow to 400 to 100 feet tall. They're also called maidenhair trees because the leaves resemble the leaflets of the maidenhair fern. The ginkgo is prized in cities as an ornamental tree, but not just that. It tolerates cold. It's very resistant to insects, fungi, and to storms, and that's why you might find them in parks. So many species of ginkgo are found as fossils. Since there's only one species of ginkgo remaining, it has earned the name living fossil. Scientists once thought that if the Chinese had not cultivated and cared for the ginkgo, it would have become extinct a long time ago, but wild ginkgos have since been found growing in very remote areas of China. A single ginkgo tree can live as long as 1,000 years. So the ginkgo is dioecious. It produces male and female reproductive parts on 2 separate trees. Male structures produce pollen on one tree, while the female structure produces seeds on a separate tree, and the pollen is spread by wind as in other gymnosperms. The seeds are surrounded by a fleshy skin that smells like rotten butter because the odor is very offensive. The female trees are not as popular in gardening as the male trees are. The name ginkgo comes from a Japanese word that means silver apricot, referring to that silvery coloring of the seeds covering. But like we said, if you go to a park to look at it, they probably don't have female trees because they have rotten butter smelling fruit. So you're probably only going to see male trees. And, they stood out to me in D.C., but I'm sure if you went to Centennial Park in Nashville, they probably have some. Any botanical garden, around probably has some stuff, ginkgo trees as well. You can buy ginkgo trees to put in your landscaping as well. So your next thing that you're going over is how to identify a tree. Just like the field guide I had on wildflowers, I've got another one on trees. And many field guides contain what's called a dichotomous identification key, which basically lets you identify a tree just like we did with insects and we did with flowers by breaking down, is it palmated? What kind of leaf is it? Palmated, serrated, and then you just go on. So it's based on leaf descriptions, fruit descriptions, bloom descriptions, those type of things, and you're able to break it down all the way into figuring out what type of plant it could be. So you see here, it will say, does it have a flower? Does it produce fruit? If so, go to 2. Then it says, is it dicot? Is it monocot? Then you go to 3. What kind of leaves? Is it scale-like? Is it non-scale-like? Then you go to 4. Does it resemble a fern or a frond? It's a cycad, and you just go on from there. I'll let you read that part on yourself. We've moved all the way to page 436. So that ends the science lesson for today. So, sorry, it took a little bit longer than normal. So remember, you're not getting anything on chapter 12 until May 4th. So let's take a word of thanksgiving to the Lord in prayer, and then this will close out your science lesson. So Heavenly Father, we praise you and thank you for giving us this moment where we can just study one of your most awesome creations, which are trees. And they give us so much, Lord. And just help us to just look out at the trees and just help the trees to remind us of your greatness as our Creator. Father, we thank you for all the things you forgive us for. And we ask for forgiveness, not just for ourselves, but also for people who may be mean and stinky to us. And we give you praise and honor and glory. In Jesus' name, amen. So have a great rest of the day. See ya.